The sun rises over the Nile like molten gold poured from a divine hand. Its light spills over the fields, the temples, the bustling markets, and finally, it touches the polished limestone walls of a nobleman's villa. Here, the air smells not of mud and grain, but of lotus blossoms and imported incense. Servants sweep the courtyards. Musicians tune their harps for the morning's entertainment. And inside, the lady of the house is deciding whether she prefers to be seen today in gold, lapis lazuli, or something more provocative. Because in the noble courts of ancient Egypt, appearance was more than vanity, it was power. The Egyptian elite lived in a world of layers. On the surface, grace, piety, order, a reflection of Ma'at, the divine balance. But beneath the gold leaf and perfumed oils, there were rivalries, affairs, conspiracies whispered in shaded gardens. A noble's life was not just about honoring the gods or serving the pharaoh. It was about staying ahead, in influence, in wealth, and in who you were seen with. And in a land where gods watched from temple walls, everyone pretended the gods weren't watching everything. A noble's home was a performance. High, whitewashed walls shielded lush gardens, with lotus palms, date palms, and shady colonnades perfect for private conversations. Inside, murals depicted scenes of feasts and offerings, reminders of wealth and status. Imported cedar from Lebanon perfumed the air, and guests, even allies, were carefully chosen. You never knew which servant carried gossip to another household, or which rival dined at your table just to count your gold bracelets. Scandal in Egypt didn't always mean a grand betrayal. Sometimes it was as small as wearing too much gold before a festival, or being seen speaking too long to a man who wasn't your husband. But sometimes it meant murder. In the noble courts, marriage was politics. Wives could be allies, pawns, or rivals. Mistresses could be weapons, and lovers could be deadly. A nobleman's wife might host feasts to display her beauty, but also to secure alliances. A noblewoman might send an expensive jar of perfumed oil to a rival's husband as a gesture of friendship, of course. A well-placed smile could win you a seat at the pharaoh's table. A poorly timed rumor could see you banished to an estate in the desert. And in this world, women had more influence than most outsiders imagine. They owned land, managed estates, corresponded with foreign royalty. Some could even inherit titles, which meant they could pass them on to whomever they wished. Egyptian nobles didn't have newspapers. They had servants. Servants heard everything. Which household had unpaid debts? Which priest drank too much wine at the temple feast? Which noble's daughter had been seen slipping out of the gardens after dark? And that information traveled, from kitchens to markets, from bathhouses to wine cellars, faster than the Nile in flood season. By the time a scandal reached the pharaoh's ears, it had often grown larger than the truth. But the damage? That was already done. And here's where I invite you to join me in this journey. If you're enjoying the slow unraveling of Egypt's most intoxicating secrets, leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Let's see just how far the Nile's waters can reach. You might be in Cairo or California. Either way, tonight, the scandals of the Nile are yours to keep. Because in the next chapter, we're stepping into the court of Queen Tai, the commoner who rose to become Egypt's most powerful woman, and whose private letters to foreign kings nearly toppled her own throne. And trust me, she wasn't writing about the weather. The scent of blue lotus drifts across the palace garden. Servants carry trays of honey cakes and pomegranates. Somewhere in the distance, the Nile glitters under the sun, a ribbon of life winding through Egypt's heart. And at the very center of that heart sits Queen Tai. She is not a princess by birth. She was not groomed from childhood to rule. She is the daughter of a noble but modest family, married to Pharaoh Amenhotep III in what many thought was a generous match. Generous and dangerous, because Tai was not content to be decorative. She would become one of the most influential women in Egyptian history, admired by some, feared by others, and whispered about by all. Tai was born in the small town of Akhmim, far from the political glitter of Thebes. Her father was a high-ranking official, her mother a respected noblewoman. but neither held the kind of power her future husband did. Amenhotep III was young, wealthy, and already a ruler when he married her. It was unusual. Egyptian pharaohs often married royal-born women to keep bloodlines pure. But Amenhotep didn't care about the old rules. He saw something in Tai: intelligence, ambition, and a mind as sharp as a copper blade. When he placed the golden vulture crown upon her head, she wasn't just queen consort. She was co-ruler. And soon, she was doing something few Egyptian queens dared to do: writing letters to foreign kings herself. In the ancient Near East, diplomacy was an art form, and usually, only pharaohs or their viziers held the brush. But Tai, she picked it up herself. Clay tablets discovered in the city of Amarna, now called the Amarna Letters, reveal a remarkable truth. Tai corresponded directly with foreign rulers, including Tushratta, the king of Mitanni, in modern-day Syria and Turkey. These weren't short, polite notes. They were personal, persuasive, and dangerously warm. One letter from Tushratta praises Tai for her wisdom, calls her his beloved sister, and hints at trust deeper than mere politics. Some scholars believe the tone suggested intimacy, not necessarily romantic, but close enough to make courtiers uneasy. You can almost hear the whispers in the palace halls. Why is the queen writing to foreign kings without the pharaoh? Why is she calling them brother? Why are they sending her gifts? And, more dangerously, what if she's making promises the pharaoh hasn't approved? Some thought she was simply securing alliances. Others feared she was shaping foreign policy to her own vision. And in a court where one wrong word could mean exile or worse, Tai's letters were not just ink on clay. They were weapons. Amenhotep III, however, seemed unbothered. He adored Tai. He had statues built in her honor, sometimes as tall as his own. He allowed her to appear beside him in official art, an honor almost never granted to queens. But this shield of affection wouldn't last forever. When Amenhotep died, their son, the infamous Akhenaten, inherited the throne. Tai retained her influence, but her foreign letters took on a new weight. Her words could tip the scales of war or peace. And in the chaos of her son's radical religious reforms, her private diplomacy became even more controversial. The Amarna letters survive to this day, their cuneiform impressions as sharp as when Tai pressed her seal into wet clay. To some historians, they prove she was a master diplomat, unafraid to speak directly to kings in an age when queens were expected to be silent. To others, they hint at improper alliances, even potential betrayal. To her rivals, they were scandal. To her admirers, they were brilliance. And to us, they are a window into a woman who could wield the pen as fiercely as any general wielded a sword. Because in the next chapter, we step into the life of another queen whose letters caused chaos, but for very different reasons. A young widow, a royal sister, a woman so desperate for protection that she reached across borders to find a husband and nearly shattered Egypt's throne in the process. Her name, Enkhsenemen, and her story begins with a tomb. The tomb is barely sealed. Incense still hangs in the air from the funeral rites. Servants have only just finished sweeping away the footprints left in the sand. The boy king Tutankhamun is dead, barely 18, and with him, perhaps the last thread of stability in Egypt's royal line. And in the palace above, Enkhsenemen is suddenly alone. She is young, barely out of girlhood, and yet she has been queen to a god king. She has walked in processions wearing gold crowns. She has been called beloved of the sun god and bowed to by nobles. But now, she is a widow in a court full of hungry men. And some of those men are her family. Enkhsenemen's position was unique and dangerous. She was the daughter of Pharaoh Akhenaten and Queen Nefertiti. She was also the half-sister, and possibly the full sister, of her late husband, Tutankhamun. This was not unusual in the Egyptian royal family. Marriages between siblings were a way to keep divine bloodlines pure. But now that Tutankhamun was gone, the expectation was clear. She would marry another man of the royal line. And the most likely candidate? Her own grandfather. Yes, the aging and powerful Ai, who had served as vizier under multiple pharaohs and who now maneuvered himself toward the throne. To Enkesenamen, the thought was unbearable. In an act that has baffled and fascinated historians for centuries, Enkesenamen took an extraordinary step. She wrote a letter, not to a priest, not to a noble, not even to a general. She wrote to a foreign king, Suppiluliuma I, ruler of the Hittite Empire, Egypt's powerful northern neighbor. Her plea, recorded in Hittite archives, was shockingly direct. My husband has died and I have no son. They say you have many sons. If you would send me one of them, he would become my husband. I would not take one of my servants and make him my husband. I am afraid. It was an unprecedented move. Egyptian queens did not marry foreigners, and certainly not foreign princes. This was more than scandal. This was political heresy. Imagine the whispers. Why is the queen reaching beyond Egypt's borders? Why does she call our highest officials servants? What does she mean by, I am afraid? Afraid of what? Or of whom? Some suspected that I was pressuring her into marriage. Others believed there was a faction at court ready to erase her entirely, to replace her with a more compliant queen. In either case, Enkesenamen's letter was a gamble with her life as the stake. Suppiluliuma, intrigued, agreed. He sent his son, Prince Zinanza, to Egypt to marry Enkesenamen. But the prince never arrived. Somewhere on the journey, perhaps at the border, perhaps deeper in the desert, Zinanza was murdered. The Hittites blamed the Egyptians. War followed, and Enkesenamen, she disappears from the historical record almost entirely after this point. Some believe she was forced to marry after all. Others suspect she was killed in the political purge that followed. Her name, once carved in stone, was chiseled away. For centuries, the story of Enkesenamen's letter has survived not in Egyptian records, which were wiped clean of her, but in the archives of her enemies, the Hittites. To the Egyptians who sought to bury her memory, she was a traitor who broke royal tradition. To modern historians, she was a desperate young queen trying to escape a marriage she could not bear. And to us, she is a reminder that even in the most gilded courts of the Nile, power could be as fragile as papyrus. Because in the next chapter, we enter a scandal so infamous it was carved into stone court records for all eternity. A queen's wife, a royal harem, a conspiracy involving magic, wax figurines, and an assassination plot against the pharaoh himself. And this time, the trial would shake Egypt to its core. The air in the palace is heavy, not with incense this time, but with something sharper. Fear. It is the 12th century BC. Pharaoh Ramses III, the warrior king who saved Egypt from invasion, sits on the throne. He is the embodiment of royal power, the living god, the unchallenged master of the two lands. But in the private chambers of the royal harem, another story is being written. It is a story of whispered promises, carved wax, and a queen who dares to imagine a different ruler, one of her own making. Her name is also Tai, not the famous queen of Amenhotep III, but a later royal wife. She is not the great royal wife. That title belongs to another. She is secondary in the official hierarchy, but in ambition, she outranks them all. Tai has a son, Pentar. But because she is not the chief queen, Pentar is not the heir to the throne. That title belongs to another son, born of another queen. And Tai does not intend to accept that. What begins as frustration becomes a plan, and not a small one. Tai begins to gather allies within the harem, women loyal to her, servants willing to take risks, and even powerful officials outside the palace. The plot has two goals: assassinate Ramses III, place Prince Pentar on the throne. But this is not just a matter of slipping poison into a wine cup. The palace is guarded, the pharaoh's person is sacred, and every movement is watched. So Tai turns to something darker. According to ancient court records, the conspirators used magic as part of their plan. Not the harmless charms of love spells and lucky amulets, but dangerous, forbidden magic. They created wax figurines of their enemies, inscribed with names and curses. They performed rituals meant to weaken the pharaoh's body and mind. They smuggled these charms into the palace with the help of servants. In ancient Egypt, magic was not superstition, it was law. Using it against the pharaoh was treason of the highest order. But for Tai and her circle, it was worth the risk. The exact details of the assassination are lost to time. Some say Ramses III was attacked during a festival. Some believe he was poisoned. Others point to forensic evidence from his mummy, a deep cut across his throat, clean and fatal. Whatever the method, one thing is certain. The plot was discovered. What followed is one of the most extraordinary events in Egyptian history. A public trial so detailed that we know the names, ranks, and fates of many involved. The surviving records, known as the Judicial Papyrus of Turin, read like a court drama. High officials questioned. Servants interrogated. Letters between conspirators presented as evidence. Magical items displayed before the judges. Over a dozen people were found guilty. Some were executed. Others, including Prince Pentar, were given the choice of suicide to avoid public execution. Pentar's body, discovered in a bizarre screaming mummy pose, may be the most haunting relic of this scandal. Ramses III did not live long after the conspiracy. Perhaps killed during the attempt, perhaps mortally wounded. He was succeeded by the rightful heir, not Tai's son. The harem was purged. The names of the guilty were erased from monuments. The women who once whispered in perfumed chambers now vanished into oblivion. But their plot and their audacity lived on in the papyrus scrolls, preserved for over 3,000 years. The harem conspiracy was more than a failed coup. It was proof that the heart of the pharaoh's palace was never entirely safe. That even behind the most guarded walls, ambition could take root. And that love for one's child could drive a queen to risk everything, even her life, to see him crowned. Because in the next chapter, we leave the palace intrigue and step into another kind of noble scandal, one of greed, betrayal, and sacrilege, when high officials and nobles turned grave robbers, plundering the very tombs they were sworn to protect. And yes, they almost got away with it. The Valley of the Kings is silent now. Only the wind moves, carrying whispers between the cliffs. But over 3,000 years ago, this silence was guarded by decree, by law, and by fear. These tombs were not just graves. They were vaults of unimaginable wealth. Gold masks, alabaster jars, cedar chests, beaded collars, statues of gods, all meant to serve a pharaoh in the afterlife. They were also tempting targets, because in the late New Kingdom, Egypt's power was waning. The treasury was thin. The Nile's floods were unpredictable. And even nobles, sworn to protect the dead, were not above breaking into their own pharaoh's tomb. We know about these crimes not from rumor, but from official court records, some of the most detailed criminal documents in the ancient world. The Abbott Papyrus and the Amherst Papyrus read like investigative reports. Names of suspects, confessions of thieves, lists of stolen goods, and chillingly precise descriptions of how they broke into the tombs. These weren't petty bandits. These were insiders, scribes, guards, priests, the very people entrusted with guarding the sacred resting places. A royal tomb was not easy to plunder. The entrances were hidden, sealed, and often cursed with inscriptions warning of divine wrath. The corridors twisted and turned, ending in massive stone doors that required multiple men to move. But the thieves had help. They had maps. They knew which chambers held the richest goods. They knew when the guards would be absent. And they moved with purpose, breaking seals, rifling through treasure, stripping gold from coffins, even unwrapping the mummies themselves to reach the jewelry beneath. Why would nobles risk such sacrilege? The answer is as old as human ambition, wealth and influence. Some nobles were deep in debt. Others saw a chance to finance political schemes. Still others simply believed that the gods would forgive them if the theft served a greater good. In truth, it often served nothing but greed. And yet, the most shocking part, many got away with it for years. The tide began to turn when rumors reached the vizier of the time, Egypt's highest official under the pharaoh. Teams were sent to inspect the tombs. Some were found completely stripped. Others showed signs of tampering, chisel marks on doors, broken seals on storerooms. When suspects were arrested, the trials revealed a web of complicity. One thief confessed that the stolen gold had been melted down and sold back to the temple, meaning the temple itself profited from the theft. Some were executed. Some were mutilated, ears or noses cut off. Some were forced into exile in distant barren lands. But others, especially high-ranking accomplices, quietly disappeared from the records, their names erased from monuments but their fates unrecorded. And this is where history goes silent. Because sometimes, punishment in ancient Egypt wasn't death. It was erasure. Your name chiseled away. Your memory forbidden. Your soul denied passage to the afterlife. These thefts were more than crimes. They were a betrayal of Egypt's deepest values. The sanctity of the dead and the eternal journey to the next world. To rob a tomb was not just to steal gold. It was to steal immortality. And in the eyes of the people, that was the greatest sin of all. Because in the next chapter, we turn from greed to passion, to the scandals that bloomed in the Lotus Gardens, where love spells, poetry, and moonlit meetings drew nobles into affairs both enchanting and ruinous. And trust me, the walls of ancient Egypt had ears. The night air is warm. The lotus flowers on the pond have closed for the evening, their scent faint but sweet. A breeze stirs the papyrus reeds. In the noble quarter, the moonlight spills over painted walls and glitters on bronze mirrors left out after a feast. Somewhere beyond the walls, a harp plays softly. Laughter drifts through the garden. And two shadows, not meant to be together, meet in the shade of a date palm. Because in ancient Egypt, the gardens of the elite were more than just places of beauty. They were stages for politics and theaters for passion. Egyptian noble gardens were lush paradises, a deliberate contrast to the desert beyond. Lotus ponds teeming with fish, shady colonnades lined with vines, orchards heavy with figs, pomegranates, and mandrake fruit. And always, the perfume of imported incense drifting from the banqueting hall. Here, nobles entertained foreign envoys, political allies, and occasionally lovers. Because in a world where marriages were arranged for power, affection often bloomed elsewhere. We know about these affairs not just from rumors, but from love poetry and graffiti preserved on temple walls and ostraca, pottery shards used for writing. Some verses were innocent, shy, almost sweet. I shall lie down in your arms tonight, and you shall call my name softly. Others were far bolder. My heart is not content unless we spend the night together, my body in your embrace. The poets speak of stolen moments in gardens, secret meetings after festivals, and the intoxicating scent of lotus flowers in the hair of a lover. Some poems even hint at magical aid, love spells designed to draw a desired person closer. Ancient Egyptians took magic seriously, and love magic was no exception. A nobleman might seek out a temple scribe to inscribe a spell on papyrus, then bury it in the path his desired lover walked. A noblewoman might burn incense infused with special herbs, letting the smoke carry her beauty to the one she sought. Some spells were tender, prayers to Hathor, goddess of love. Others were forceful, designed to compel the target to think of nothing else until they came. Of course, if the object of affection was married, or worse, married to someone powerful, the risks were high. An affair between nobles could be discreet, gifts exchanged in public as tokens of friendship, private feasts disguised as political meetings. But if discovered, the consequences could be ruinous. At best, a quiet exile to an estate far from the capital. At worst, public shaming, loss of land, stripping of titles, and in rare but severe cases, execution, especially if the affair hinted at political treason. Yet, the risks didn't stop them. The great religious festivals, dedicated to Hathor, Batet, or Ammonius, were often cover for romantic encounters. The temples overflowed with wine, music, and dancing. Processions spilled into the streets. Crowds mingled in ways they normally could not. In such chaos, a noble woman could slip away from her family. A nobleman could vanish from a banquet. And two people could meet in a garden, their tryst masked by the sound of drums and singing. Some of these stories ended quietly. A lover married off to another, a whispered goodbye in the Lotus Grove. Others ended in scandal that made its way into court gossip and temple whispers. But most, they left no names behind. Only the poetry remains, the eternal voice of those who loved dangerously, who risked reputation and ruin for a touch, a kiss, a single night under the moon. Because in the next chapter, we turn to the priests, men meant to serve the gods, but who often served their own ambitions. High priests who outmaneuvered kings, seized power, and blurred the line between divine right and political conquest. Chapter 7, Divine Lies. When priests became kings, we'll take you into the incense-filled sanctuaries, where crowns were not always made of gold, and loyalty to the gods sometimes meant loyalty to no one. The temple doors groan open at dawn. Incense coils upward, thick and sweet, catching the first rays of sunlight. Statues of the gods loom in the dimness, their eyes inlaid with precious stones that glint like living fire. The air hums with chanting, the rhythmic clap of sistrums, the low rumble of sacred drums. And at the very heart of this sacred world stands the high priest of Ammonius. He is not a king, not officially, but in Thebes he might as well be. Because in Egypt's later dynasties, when pharaohs grew weaker, the priests of Ammonius grew stronger. And some of them did not merely serve the gods, they ruled in their names. The temple of Ammonius at Karnak was more than a house of worship. It was a city within a city. It owned farmland, herds, ships, and workshops. It employed thousands, from scribes and craftsmen to guards and sailors. It collected offerings in gold, grain, and luxury goods from across Egypt. By the late New Kingdom, the temple's wealth rivaled, and in some periods surpassed, the pharaoh's treasury. And the man who controlled it, he could make or break kings. One of the most notorious figures of this priestly power surge was Herihor. He began as a military officer under Ramses XI, rising through the ranks as Egypt's political structure faltered. When civil unrest and economic collapse weakened the crown, Herihor was appointed high priest of Ammonius. From there, he blurred the lines between priest and pharaoh. He wore royal regalia. He had his name inscribed in royal cartouches, something only kings were meant to have. He commissioned temple scenes showing himself performing kingly duties, right alongside his priestly ones. And while Ramses XI remained the nominal ruler, Herihor effectively governed Upper Egypt from Thebes. How did they get away with it? The priests claimed that Ammonius himself had chosen them to guard Egypt when mortal kings failed. They portrayed themselves not as usurpers, but as saviors, men who would keep the temples fed, the gods appeased, and the people safe from chaos. But the reality was messier. Priests appointed their own family members to lucrative temple posts. They controlled tax collection, trade routes, and even judicial decisions in their territories. And if the pharaoh in the north disagreed, well, Ammonius was conveniently interpreted otherwise. The kings who ruled from the delta, far from Thebes, faced a problem. They could not openly challenge the priests without risking civil war. The priests controlled not just wealth, but public belief. To attack them was to risk appearing impious, a dangerous image for a divine ruler. So, uneasy truces formed. The pharaoh reigned in name. The high priest ruled in fact. Of course, where there is unchecked power, there is scandal. Records hint at priests diverting temple goods for personal use. Lavish feasts funded by offerings meant for the gods. Quiet arrangements with foreign traders, bypassing royal oversight. Temple women, sworn to purity, engaged in affairs with high-ranking clergy. In theory, temples were models of order and discipline. In practice, they were political machines, with incense to mask the smell of ambition. By the end of the New Kingdom, Egypt was effectively split in two. The north ruled by the pharaoh in the delta, the south ruled by the high priests of Ammonius in Thebes. It would not be the last time religion and politics entwined like reeds on the Nile, but it may have been one of the most shameless, because in the sacred halls of Karnak, where the god's voice was said to speak through oracles, It was often the high priest's whisper that shaped Egypt's fate. And so, we arrive at the final scandal of our journey, one that touches every chapter before it. The lies, the ambition, the betrayal, they all fade into the same silence. A tomb, because in death, even the most scandalous nobles sought the same thing, to be remembered well. But death in ancient Egypt was never simple. The sun sets over the desert. The sand turns gold, then crimson, then a deep purple as night claims the horizon. In the distance, the silhouettes of tombs rise from the earth. Doors to eternity, carved into the cliffs and hidden beneath the sands. For the nobles of ancient Egypt, death was not an end. It was a performance, a final statement of power, wealth, and status. A chance to secure one's place among the gods. And as with all things touched by power, even death was not free from intrigue, greed, and scandal. For Egypt's elite, a proper burial was as important as life itself. Perfumed oils from Punt, linens woven so fine they shimmered in torchlight, gold jewelry heavy with symbolism, scarabs for rebirth, ankhs for eternal life, amulets tucked into layers of linen, each with a spell for protection. Tombs were stocked with furniture, food, wine, cosmetics, and even shabby figurines, little servants carved to work for the deceased in the afterlife. It was an opulent send-off and a temptation. The truth was, a noble's journey to the afterlife was also a business. Priests charged enormous fees for burial rites. Embalmers accepted bribes to include, or forget, certain expensive rituals. Scribes corrected inscriptions for a price, ensuring the deceased would have the most favorable identity before the gods. Families competed to outdo each other, not just in the tomb's construction, but in how quickly and grandly the burial took place. And when money ran out, some nobles cut corners, skipping protective spells, reusing coffins, or burying without proper offerings. In a society obsessed with the afterlife, this was scandal enough to stain a family name. It happened more than once. A tomb commissioned for one noble was repurposed for another, usually after the first died before completion, or if a rival pulled strings to claim it. Some were even stolen outright, names chipped off walls, new ones carved in their place. In death, identity itself could be erased and replaced. One infamous case in Thebes involved a noble who died suddenly while in debt. His creditors seized not just his property, but his tomb, selling it to another family before his burial. His body was left in a hastily dug grave, without the rites needed to reach the field of reeds, Egypt's paradise. To his enemies, it was justice. To his friends, it was sacrilege. You might think tomb robbers were desperate men from the streets. But sometimes, the thieves were nobles themselves. There are records, written in painstaking hieratic script, of high officials caught with stolen amulets, gold bands, even the wrappings of mummies. In one trial, a noble confessed to stripping jewelry from the corpse of a woman he had once entertained in life. He justified it by saying, "The gold does not serve her in the West. It serves the living." It was a chilling reminder that death did not protect you from envy or greed. Even burial sites could be political. A pharaoh might grant a noble a place in a prestigious necropolis as a reward for loyalty. Another might order a traitor's tomb destroyed, condemning him to eternal death, the greatest punishment imaginable. Some nobles were buried far from the capital to hide their resting place from rivals. Others constructed false tombs to confuse thieves and perhaps enemies. As you walk today through the tombs of the nobles at Luxor, the colors are still vivid. The banquet scenes still show women smelling lotus blossoms, men drinking wine, servants offering delicacies. But behind the beauty is a truth Egypt's elite knew well. The afterlife was as much about status as salvation. To the gods, perhaps all souls were equal. But to the living, even in death, some still had more gold in their coffins. And so our journey through Egypt's noble scandals comes to a close. From the letters of powerful queens, to murder plots in perfumed chambers, to forbidden affairs and stolen tombs, we've seen that power and beauty walk hand in hand with ambition and deceit. But we are not finished yet. The torches flare in the banquet hall. Perfume fills the air, heavy with myrrh and blue lotus. Musicians pluck their harps. Dancers sway in thin linen dresses, their hair perfumed with cones of scented fat that slowly melt under the heat, releasing sweetness into the air. The long tables groan with roast goose, fresh figs, honey cakes, and pitchers of wine so strong it would make a scribe forget his own name. But among the nobles reclining on carved ivory chairs, it's not the food that matters tonight. It's the whispers, because in ancient Egypt, a banquet wasn't just a party. It was a stage, a place where alliances were made, enemies were ruined, and scandal began with a single cup of wine. Invitations to a noble banquet were political currency. To be seated close to the host meant favor. To be placed near the musicians meant you were barely tolerated. To be left off the guest list entirely? That was a public insult, one that could destroy a reputation. But even those lucky enough to be invited were not safe. Banquets were where rival families spread rumors disguised as jokes, where drunken tongues slipped secrets, and where lovers exchanged glances across the table, sometimes noticed, sometimes not. Wine in ancient Egypt was a luxury. It came from royal vineyards in the Delta, or imported from Canaan and Cyprus in clay amphorae sealed with resin. For nobles, serving rare vintages was a way to show off. But it was also dangerous. The stronger the wine, the looser the conversation. And the looser the conversation, the faster scandals were born. One papyrus account describes a noble banquet where a high official, drunk on imported red, boasted about skimming gold from temple construction. By morning, the story had reached the pharaoh's ears. The official was retired to a remote estate. He never returned to Thebes. Banquets were also where romance could ignite or be exposed. Couples met in the dim glow of oil lamps, slipping away between courses. Flirtations bloomed during drinking games, when a guest might offer a cup to another with the traditional blessing. May you live in health and smell the lotus. It sounded innocent enough, but in the right tone, it was an invitation. Sometimes those invitations led to scandal the very next day. Not all wine was offered in love. Egyptian history whispers of banquets where cups were laced with poisons, hemlock, desert herbs, or even powdered stones. A death by wine was easy to disguise. The victim slumped, overcome by drink. And by the time the body was prepared for burial, the evidence was gone. One late New Kingdom rumor tells of a banquet where 3 guests died in one night, all rivals of the host. The official record blames spoiled wine. The truth, lost in the shadows. Some banquets were planned specifically to test loyalty. A host might seat 2 rivals side by side, watching for tension. He might ask leading questions over dessert, waiting to see who hesitated before answering. The right misstep could mean the loss of a title, land, or even one's life. And so a banquet could elevate you, or end you. When the music stopped and the lamps burned low, the guests stumbled home through quiet streets. Some carried new promises, others carried new enemies, and some carried secrets they could never speak aloud. Because in Egypt, as in any kingdom, what happened at the banquet never truly stayed at the banquet. The next day, the gossip began. And sometimes, that gossip would change the course of history. The temple courtyard is silent. Not the peaceful silence of devotion, but the thick, careful hush of fear. At the center, a scribe kneels before the high altar, reading from a papyrus in a trembling voice. The gods are angry, he says. They have sent dreams and omens. They have named the guilty. Everyone in the court shifts uncomfortably. Because in ancient Egypt, when the gods accused you, it didn't matter if you were innocent. Egypt's religion was powerful, so powerful that it could be used as a weapon. If a noble wanted to destroy a rival without spilling a drop of blood, there was a method. Invoke the gods. A priest might receive a vision from Ammonius or Hathor, naming the rival as a traitor. A sacred statue in a festival procession might turn its head toward the accused, guided, of course, by human hands. An oracle might deliver a verdict that just happened to match the accuser's wishes. Once the god's judgment was spoken, there was almost no defense. Curses in Egypt weren't just mystical threats scrawled in tombs. They could be deliberately staged as political attacks. A rival might secretly plant cursed figurines, little wax or clay models inscribed with your name, in your home or garden. When they were discovered by priests, it became proof of dark magic. And in Egypt, practicing harmful magic could carry the death penalty. The irony: some of the loudest public opponents of magic were themselves using it to remove competitors. The most famous case of religious manipulation is tied to the harem conspiracy against Ramses III. But while history remembers the royal wives and servants, we often forget the nobles who fanned the flames. High-ranking officials whispered to priests. Priests whispered to oracles. Oracles declared that the king's time was at an end. The conspirators didn't just want to kill Ramses. They wanted the people to believe the gods demanded it. And for a time, it worked. In the later dynasties, some oracles became so corrupt that audiences could buy the answer they wanted. Pay enough gold, and the god statue would nod yes at your question. Offer land, and the god would shake his head no toward your rival. One ostracon from Deir el-Medina even records a man complaining that his opponent paid the god to speak against me. It's a rare, almost cynical glimpse behind the curtain, proof that divine wrath could be scripted like a play. For the victims, there was no easy way out. Even if you escaped execution, being publicly cursed meant exile, loss of property, and a reputation that followed you to your grave. Families would distance themselves. Servants would refuse to serve. Friends would suddenly remember an urgent trip to Memphis. Some accused nobles fled into the desert, becoming wandering traders or scribes for hire far from the Nile. Others simply vanished. But gods, like politics, could be fickle. Just as suddenly as they condemned someone, the priests could receive a new vision clearing them of all charges, usually after a generous donation or a political shift in the court. It was a reminder to all nobles. In Egypt, you didn't just need the favor of the pharaoh. You needed the favor of the gods, or at least of the men who spoke for them. And with that, our final scandal comes to a close. From palace chambers to garden walls, from wine-soaked banquets to the incense-thick sanctuaries of Karnak, the scandals of Egypt's nobles show us one thing: power in any age is never clean. The temple is quiet after midnight. Moonlight spills through the tall stone columns, painting silver stripes across the courtyard. Somewhere in the shadows, footsteps echo, slow, careful, deliberate. They are not the steps of a worshiper. They are the steps of a thief. And the target? Not gold, not jewels, but the statues of the gods themselves. In ancient Egypt, statues weren't just art. They were living embodiments of the gods. They were bathed, perfumed, dressed in fine linen, and adorned with jewelry. Offerings of bread, beer, wine, and meat were placed before them daily. In the eyes of the faithful, these statues could bless harvests, cure illness, and protect the nation. And in the eyes of a greedy noble, they were portable gold mines. The most daring thefts were often inside jobs. A noble who served as overseer of a temple might loan a statue to a private shrine in his estate permanently. Others would quietly remove valuable amulets, crowns, or necklaces from the statues, replacing them with cheap replicas. The records tell us of one case in Thebes where a high-ranking noble smuggled an entire cult statue out of a small provincial temple, had it stripped of its gold leaf, and then sold the wood to a furniture maker. When the theft was discovered, he claimed the god had chosen to leave the temple. The priests were unconvinced. Even stranger were the cases of divine ransom. A noble or a hired thief would steal a statue from a wealthy temple, hide it, and then approach the priests with an offer. For the right donation, the god will be returned. Some priests paid quietly to avoid scandal. Others launched full-scale investigations, hiring their own spies to track the missing deity. In one recorded incident, the thief's own household slaves turned him in, after he refused to share the ransom payment. Stealing statues wasn't always about money. It could also be a political statement. If a rival noble was closely associated with a certain temple, stealing that temple's main cult image could damage his prestige. It was the ancient equivalent of burning his family crest or demolishing his estate's gates. In one particularly audacious act, a noble arranged for a statue of a war god to be stolen just before a rival was due to lead a military campaign. When the god failed to appear in the pre-battle blessings, the rival's soldiers took it as a bad omen and deserted. Of course, stealing from the gods was dangerous. The punishment wasn't just legal, it was spiritual. If the priests caught you, you faced public trial, confiscation of property, and even execution. If the gods caught you, well, every illness, crop failure, and strange noise at night could be seen as their wrath. One ostracon from Deir el-Medina records the death of a noble's son, attributed directly to the theft of a temple statue. The father was said to have returned the statue the next morning, dressed in fresh linen and perfumed with lotus oil. Today, some temples in Egypt stand empty, their statues long gone, their sanctuaries silent. Archaeologists often assume time and erosion took them. But perhaps in a few cases, the gods were carried away under moonlight, the echo of sandals fading into the desert. Because in Egypt, even the gods themselves were not safe from scandal. The river glitters under the moon. A reed boat drifts quietly between the papyrus beds, carrying a single passenger, a noblewoman wrapped in fine linen, clutching a sealed letter. To her friends, she is simply visiting family. To the palace, she is something far more dangerous, a messenger of secrets. Egypt's pharaohs did not rule alone. They ruled through an intricate web of loyal nobles, some warriors, some priests, some merchants, and some spies. These spies were not the shadowy assassins of later history. They were high-ranking nobles who could move freely between courts, overhear private conversations, and send information back to the palace. Often, the most effective of these spies were women, queens, concubines, and lady guests at noble estates, whose presence at banquets and festivals was rarely questioned. Romantic affairs were the perfect cover. A noblewoman might begin a discreet relationship with a high official from a rival province. While her lover thought he was whispering sweet poetry, he was actually revealing troop movements, tax disputes, or political alliances. The palace scribe receiving her letters would then copy them onto papyrus, carefully coded so the message appeared to be a love poem. But a trained reader could extract the hidden meaning. Of course, this kind of work could easily spiral into scandal. One well-known case from the late New Kingdom involves a nobleman who discovered that the mistress he had been showering with gold and fine linen was actually reporting his every word to the pharaoh. He confronted her during a festival. The argument turned violent. Both were arrested, he for plotting against the throne, she for unauthorized contact with a provincial official. Rumor has it, the pharaoh quietly released her within a week. The nobleman, however, was sent to labor on a fortress wall in Nubia. Sometimes, letters weren't carried by people at all. A noble spy might bribe a merchant caravan to hide a papyrus in a jar of incense or a basket of figs. On the receiving end, another noble, equally trusted by the pharaoh, would open it, copy the information, and destroy the original. In one instance, a letter disguised as a property deed was found during a routine estate inspection. The discovery triggered an investigation that brought down 3 prominent officials. Not all espionage happened in palace gardens. During harvest season, nobles with ties to the court would mingle among workers, listening for complaints about taxes, shortages, or corruption. Reports of unrest could be sent directly to the palace, and those mentioned often found themselves invited to explain their conduct before the vizier. Some of these reports were true, others were convenient lies. Occasionally, the spy themselves became the story. 2 nobles, both secretly working for the pharaoh, fell in love while exchanging coded messages. When they realized they were on the same side, they married, only to have their union viewed with suspicion by the palace. Were they loyal servants, or a dangerous alliance that could one day turn against the throne? History does not record their fate. Perhaps they lived quietly on a river estate. Perhaps they vanished into the shadows of the court, their story one more whisper on the Nile. Somewhere in a museum storeroom today, there may still be papyrus letters that look like harmless poetry, but once carried the fate of provinces within their folds. The ink may have faded, the names may be lost, but the truth remains. In Egypt, love and loyalty could be masks, and the nobles who played both roles knew that a single letter could bring them riches or ruin. The night is windless. The Valley of the Kings sleeps under a black sky, the cliffs casting long shadows over the silent tomb entrances. A jackal's cry echoes once, then fades. Somewhere inside a narrow shaft, a flickering oil lamp reveals the guilty faces of men who should not be here. They are not common thieves. They are nobles, and tonight they will rob the dead. To the average Egyptian, tomb robbery was the ultimate sin, a crime against the gods, the pharaoh, and the soul of the deceased. But to a desperate or greedy noble, it could also be a quick path to wealth. The tombs of kings, queens, and high officials held not only gold but also priceless amulets, fine linen, alabaster vessels, and rare perfumes. Each piece had both monetary and magical value. And unlike raiding a living rival's estate, robbing the dead carried no risk of an immediate sword at your throat, only the risk of curses, divine retribution, and the law. Most successful tomb robberies weren't random. They required inside help. A noble involved in temple administration might know when guards rotated shifts. An overseer of tomb construction could remember the layout of the burial chambers. A scribe might even have a copy of the inventory, a shopping list for the afterlife. These nobles would sometimes hire trusted workers from the necropolis villages, offering a share of the loot in exchange for silence. We know about some of these crimes from real trial records, like those of the infamous tomb robbery papyri from the 20th dynasty. In these documents, nobles are named and questioned alongside common laborers. Some confessed under torture. Others swore innocence while suspiciously living far above their means. One accused noble claimed the gold jewelry found in his home was a gift from a grateful widow. The court was skeptical. Looted goods didn't always stay in Egypt. Some were smuggled to foreign merchants along the coast, exchanged for cedar wood, wine, or exotic animals. But much of it was quietly sold in the black markets of Thebes, where amulets once laid on the chest of a pharaoh could end up hanging from the neck of a wealthy merchant's wife. Even worse, some nobles recycled funerary goods, stripping names from sarcophagi to reuse them for their own burials. In one documented case, a noble buried himself in a coffin made for a high priest 2 generations earlier. Tomb robbery carried severe penalties: execution, mutilation, or exile. But for many nobles, the fear of curses was just as real as the fear of the law. The Egyptians believed the dead could strike back, sending nightmares, illness, or bad fortune to those who violated their rest. One papyrus tells of a noble who robbed a tomb and later claimed to be haunted by the voice of the dead man, calling his name in the night. Desperate, he returned every item and paid for a new burial ceremony. Whether it worked, no one knows. By the end of the New Kingdom, so many tombs had been plundered, sometimes by the very officials tasked with protecting them, that priests began hiding royal mummies in secret caches. Those mummies, discovered thousands of years later, bear the marks of hurried reburials. Mismatched coffins, stripped jewelry, and linen wrappings layered over ancient wounds. Each missing treasure is a whisper of scandal, a reminder that even in death, the nobles of Egypt were not safe from the greed of their own kind. The courtyard smells of blue lotus and frankincense. A mirror of polished copper reflects the face of a noblewoman as a servant applies crushed malachite to her eyelids. Nearby, alabaster jars of scented oils sit in neat rows, their stoppers sealed with beeswax. In Egypt, beauty was not just vanity. It was power, a tool as sharp as any blade. And in the courts of the Nile, some were willing to kill for it. The Egyptians believed beauty reflected divine favor. A noble who appeared youthful and flawless could command respect, attract allies, and secure political marriages. This obsession created a thriving industry: perfumers, wig makers, jewelers, and cosmetic artisans, many of whom served the same clients for decades. But it also created rivalries. If your appearance faded, your influence could vanish with it. And in some cases, rivals didn't wait for time to do the work. Coal, the black eye paint beloved by nobles, was often made from lead-based minerals. Applied daily, it could slowly poison the wearer, causing fatigue, tremors, or worse. While most saw it as a harmless tradition, there are whispers of nobles deliberately gifting special coal mixtures to rivals, laced with toxic herbs or concentrated lead. One story from the court of a late New Kingdom pharaoh tells of a royal concubine who fell mysteriously ill, her once luminous skin turning pale and blotched. Only after her death did a perfumer admit to altering her cosmetics. Under orders from another woman of the court, perfume was even more dangerous. Egyptian perfumes were potent, made from oils steeped with flowers, spices, and resins. Some formulas included rare ingredients brought by trade caravans, cinnamon from Punt, myrrh from Arabia. But those same oils could carry toxins. Applied to the skin or scalp, they could cause rashes, hair loss, or organ failure. One papyrus from Deir el-Medina hints at a scandal in which a nobleman's new bride died within a month of receiving a lavish bridal chest of scented oils from his former lover. Wigs were essential for noble fashion, elaborate, perfumed creations of human hair, sheep's wool, and palm fiber. They were also status symbols, with the finest wigs costing as much as a small estate. Theft and sabotage were common. A rival might bribe a wigmaker to deliver an inferior product or accidentally set a scented wig cone alight during a festival. In one notorious festival incident, a noblewoman's wig caught fire during a torchlit dance, an accident the witnesses described with suspiciously little shock. Sometimes beauty was used as bait. A stunning noblewoman might be sent to seduce a political target, extract secrets, and then disappear. In rare cases, she might be disgraced publicly to ruin her family's standing, all part of a larger scheme. In the courts of the Nile, your face could open doors, but it could also mark you for destruction. Today, fragments of alabaster jars and polished mirrors lie in museum cases, silent witnesses to Egypt's beauty culture. To the modern eye, they are elegant relics. But to the nobles who once owned them, they were tools of survival in a world where looking flawless could mean the difference between ruling and being ruined. The river moves as it always has. Slow, patient, eternal. It does not hurry for the rise of a pharaoh, nor pause for the fall of a noble. It has carried the whispers of scandal for thousands of years, and will carry them for thousands more. We have walked together through banquet halls heavy with perfume, through gardens lit by flickering oil lamps, through shadowed corridors where secrets traded hands like coins. We have seen nobles gamble their fortunes, their reputations, even their lives, for love, for power, for beauty, for revenge. The walls of their villas are gone now. Their fine linen has crumbled to dust. Their voices are silent. Yet their scandals survive, carved into temple reliefs, scratched onto ostraca, tucked into the folds of ancient papyrus. Somewhere, in a museum drawer or an unopened tomb, there may still be a letter, a bracelet, a stolen statue, each one holding a story that could upend what we think we know. It's easy to see the ancient world as a place of distant gods and unchanging rituals. But behind the gold, the incense, the processions, were people who loved too much, who hated too deeply, who plotted, lied, schemed, and dreamed. People who, in the end, were not so different from us. As the Nile slips away into the night, we leave them where we found them, among the silk and the shadows, caught between the eternal and the fleeting. Their names may be carved in stone, but it is the whispers that will always remain.